A defining moment is an event that determines all subsequent outcomes. A defining moment is a point of decision that determines the future. We all have defining moments in our lives, like when we graduate, when we get married or have children. This midterm election is a defining moment in the life of America. Now, I've known you heard people in every election saying, this is the most important election in history. So we tend to think that it's just hyperbole. It's really just another election. But this is not just another election. It could just be the last one, or at least the last one where black people's ability to have meaningful participation is concerned. You see, America is in the midst of a great moral and philosophical contest between the past and the future. It is deciding if we're going to go backward or forward, if we're going to be a democratic country ruled by the majority or an autocratic country ruled by a minority. It is shaping up to be our third civil war. The first one decided the issue of slavery. The second one decided the issue of civil rights for black people. And now this third one is a struggle to decide whether America is going to move toward a truly democratic society, or if it's going to double down on preserving the racism, white nationalism, and white supremacy of the past. Now, I'm not saying that this election will resolve these issues once and for all, but I am saying that it is a defining moment that will determine our direction for a long time to come. Our scripture is from Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. In it, a new Pharaoh comes to power in Egypt and decides that he has a demographic problem. He says, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous. You see, over the generations of living in Egypt, the Israelites have become numerous and prosperous. They've been loyal, hardworking, law-abiding, and valuable assets to Egyptian society. But Egypt has been under threat from the Hyksos people who invaded, and the Egyptians were only able to beat them back with the help of the Nubians, their African cousins from further south. This made the new Pharaoh fear that if they were invaded and the Israelites were to join in with the invaders, they wouldn't have a chance. So seemingly overnight, a new law was decreed, and the Israelites went from being valued citizens to oppressed slaves. That was a defining moment in Israel's history. Most people have little awareness of how suddenly and dramatically our lives can be changed and turned upside down by laws and policies by those in power. The Jews in the 1930s Germany were leading citizens. They were mayors, college professors, captains of industry, business owners, doctors, lawyers, scientists, engineers. They were the elites of society. They had no idea that in the space of just a few years that they could possibly go from the cream of the crop to concentration camps, from leading citizens to genocide in gas ovens. People who gain control of the government use its vast power to serve their interests. And when their interests conflict with yours, you're in a world of trouble. So it is important to use whatever means you have to determine who runs the country while you have a chance. In America, in a democracy, that means voting. For the last decade, a quiet panic has been sweeping white America. It's been quiet because they didn't want us to know about it. But it wasn't quiet among white people. In the 2000 census, it was discovered that an unprecedented stagnation in population growth was underway in America. This lack of population growth was most pronounced among the white population, which was older and suffering declining fertility rates. The white death rate, they found, exceeded the white birth rate. This population stagnation was projected to be leading to a dramatic demographic shift. And by 2043, the white population would be down to 47%, no longer the majority of the country. For the first time in United States history, white people were facing the threat of losing their status as the country's majority. For many white Americans, this was as terrifying as if scientists had just discovered that Earth was on a collision course with an asteroid. No major white country in history has ever lost the majority. Suddenly, they were trying to figure out, how did this happen? America had always consciously sought to maintain its white majority at 90%. From the very beginning of the country, the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited non-white immigration to maintain that 90% majority at all times. This overwhelming majority trapped black people in an airtight cage of total powerlessness for almost 200 years. In 1965, 85% of the American population was white. Today, the census reports that that number has dropped to 75%. But it only gets that high because it includes the 19% Hispanics as white. So in reality, the white population is about 55%. In the last 50 years, 60 million immigrants have entered the United States, mostly from Asia and Latin America. So today, a baby is born in the United States every 7 seconds. Each day, the size of the US population increases by more than 8,000 people. 90% of that growth consists of people of color. Every 13 seconds, someone in America dies. And since 80% of the people over 65 are white, the overwhelming majority of deaths every day are of white people. That means roughly 90% of the people being born are people of color, and 80% of the people dying are white. As a result, the average age of white Americans today is 65 years old. And the average age of Americans of color is 18. That does not bode well for a white majority in the future. That asteroid is getting closer. Already, the majority of students in American public schools are students of color. Now add to this the fact that today 90% of all immigrants coming into America are people of color. This means that America is getting darker every minute of every hour of every day. Scientists have even reported that the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the rate of demographic change by leading to the deaths of primarily older Americans. Throughout American history, whiteness has been the passport to privilege and the best of everything. White nationalists believe this is a country built by white people for white people. It's theirs, and the rest of us are just guests. A white nationalist that was railing against the 1619 Project was asked, what role was he willing to admit that black people had in the building of America? He said, oh, about the same as the horse. White nationalists consider black people as equipment, not citizens. So today, with the success of non-white people, many white people are driven by a perceived decline in the value of whiteness. This perception has created fear, anxiety, and insecurity. Due to the rapid demographic change that is often called the browning of America, many white Americans feel that they are in the throes of an existential crisis. They not only fear the loss of white supremacy, they also fear the end of whiteness, period, as it is gradually absorbed into a vast ocean of melanin, a phenomenon they refer to as white genocide. They believe that they are not only fighting for the preservation of their way of life, they believe they are fighting for their raw physical survival. They really fear the prospect of having to compete with black people on a level playing field, or even worse, living in a country where black people have the upper hand. Now, we normally don't hear these hair on fire conversations because they take places where we're not in the room. But the constant stoking of fear by racist prophets of doom, whether they be white nationalist preachers or politicians, has created the mentality that patriotism means defending white supremacy by any means and at all costs. As a result, a significant portion of white America wraps themselves in the flag and feel totally justified in doing things today that would have been unthinkable yesterday. Over the last few years, these white supremacists, right-wing militia groups, Christian evangelicals, QAnon adherents, angry white people, fearful white people have merged into a cult of white nationalism that poses a unique danger. They see themselves as being involved in an apocalyptic struggle for white power and survival. One group, the Oath Keepers, stated goal is to make these people fear us again. They believe they have a divine right to do whatever it takes to maintain total domination, and they are willing to topple the foundations of civilization to stop the changes that are already underway. One of the most important battlefields in the effort to preserve the power of whiteness is in politics. The 2020 election was expected to be the first in American history where less than 70% of the electorate were white voters. Republicans ran a masterful fear campaign that scared white folks to death. As a result, terrified white voters had a big turnout at the polls, raising their numbers to 74% of all voters. This was a great success, greater than they ever hoped for, and they felt that victory was assured. So when Donald Trump lost, even with 74% of the voters being white, white nationalists literally lost their minds. The message was clear. They had lost America. The only card left to play was to declare that the Democratic Party was illegitimate. So in unison, they adopted Trump's big lie. White nationalist leaders included politicians, radio talk show hosts, Fox News personalities, right-wing militia groups, and evangelical preachers all worked together to whip white nationalists into a lynch mob frenzy. They repeated false stories of how black people in big cities had stuffed the ballot box in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Atlanta. Stories of how black election officials had thrown away countless ballots for the Republican tickets. Stories of how dead people had voted. Stories of how they knew nobody that voted for Joe Biden. Stories of how they saw nothing in their neighborhoods or in their small towns but Trump signs. One woman truck driver even said that she drove more than 200 miles every day and saw nothing but Donald Trump signs, so she refused to believe that Joe Biden had won their state. The election had to be stolen. This insane, indignant outrage was the fuel behind the January 6th insurrection, where the lynch mob lynched democracy. They were telling the world that there would be no peaceful transfer of power unless they won. And if democracy, which is based on having the majority of the voters, is not going to work for them, then the hell with democracy. Republican-controlled state legislatures after that went to work right away, creating even more draconian voter suppression laws than were already on the books. They had already excluded many people from voting with voter ID laws, closing polling places, purging voter rolls, limiting early voting, and racist gerrymandering. Now, with the conviction that white domination was in question, Republican-led states felt no obligation to even appear to be fair. They did everything they could to drive the number of progressive voters down. A tsunami of hurdles was erected to frustrate black voters, non-white voters, and young white voters. In his new book, White Fear, How the Browning of America is Making White Folks Lose Their Minds, Roland Martin says, "I'm still registered to vote in Texas, and I can tell you there is no greater threat to democracy in the United States than the Republican Party in Texas." Democrats have been highly successful in Harris County, Houston, Dallas County, Dallas, and Bahia County, San Antonio, the larger counties in Texas. They have decimated the Republican Party in the suburbs. The Democrats were a few seats, just a few seats, from taking control of the Texas House in 2020. The Republicans realized that the Latino population is driving the increase in congressional seats. They want to maintain power as much as they can for their white base. What they have been doing is protecting their incumbents, and that is why they are scrambling to suppress voting. The state Senate passed a bill limiting extended early voting hours, prohibiting drive-through voting, banning election officials from proactively sending vote-by-mail applications, and allowing poll watchers to videotape voters receiving assistance in filling out their ballots, essentially allowing poll watchers to intimidate the voters. This isn't about protecting voting. This is the actual fraud. It is a power grab aimed at preventing the opposition from voting. In her 2018 gubernatorial race, Stacey Abrams ran a bold new campaign that has revolutionized strategy for Democrats seeking office. Her strategy wasn't about trying to flip the former white voters back to their pre-1980 Democratic roots. She didn't try to appeal to white nationalists. She focused on bringing out an electorate that had been suppressed and denied for generations. She mobilized the unregistered black voters, progressive white voters, apathetic and apolitical voters, Latino voters, LGBTQIA voters, and first-time college voters, and created an incredible coalition that elected 2 senators from Georgia. One of them, the first black senator from Georgia in history. Her strategy was to overwhelm the suppression machine, to come out in such overwhelming numbers that we actually wipe out the advantage that voter suppression efforts create. But white nationalists are convinced that black people don't have that kind of discipline or commitment. They believe if they make it inconvenient to vote, that most of us will stay at home. They believe that we are easily frustrated and distracted. They believe that we are lazy and apathetic. And if they erect a few roadblocks, we will give up. They believe if they can make the process so ugly and distasteful, then we will just avoid the whole thing. But what they don't understand is that it's always been difficult for us to vote. We've always been suppressed, intimidated, coerced, cheated, and killed. Black difficulty in voting is nothing new. Some of the greatest acts of violence in American history have been around the issue of voting rights, because in America, in a democracy, voting is power. We need to understand that we have to use democracy while we still have it. In this defining moment, Republicans are poised to regain the House and possibly the Senate, paving the way for a second Trump presidency. Once white nationalists gain control of the government again, there won't be any democracy for us to participate in. If you think the present acts of voter suppression are egregious, you ain't seen nothing yet. Once minority rule is codified in the law, we'll be facing Jim Crow 2.0, living as resident alien second-class citizens. The last time we lost the right to vote, it took almost 100 years to get it back. And during that 100 years, we were exploited, brutalized, lynched, redlined, sterilized, discriminated against, overtaxed, underrepresented, over-incarcerated, and undereducated, denied full citizenship, and it was all perfectly legal. The people who dominate the government make the law. They make the policy. They establish the rules. They decide who gets what. They decide what is legal and what is not. When you get control of the government by whatever means, you have the power. You control law enforcement, the military, the economy, education, the media. You control it all. And when they're in charge, they're going to seek to goad black people into some blind rage activity where they can settle all of this once and for all. This is why this election is a defining moment. Insecure white people are dangerous. And they are shocked and ashamed they let things get this far. They are determined to set things straight. We have to vote in this election like we have never voted before. We have to understand that not voting is the same as voting for the other side. We have to overwhelm the suppression machine in as many places as we can. Then we have to work to dismantle the suppression machine by law. It's a zero-sum game. Either we're going to gain control of the government and preserve democracy, or they're going to gain control of the government and destroy it. Destroying it actually serves their interests because increasingly they don't have the numbers to maintain control in a democratic system. They have to move the goalposts by creating some kind of minority control system that excludes the majority from meaningful participation in the political process. The white nationalists have already been looking at minority-controlled government models in other parts of the world to determine what their America will look like in the future. The handwriting is on the wall. We have to do what we can while we can to limit the effect of this assault on democracy. Make no mistake about it. This is a defining moment for our people, our children, and our future. So what are you going to do about it? Amen and Ashe.